The strategic situation and thinking in the United States changed around 1950 as the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War and the conflict in Korea heated up the rapidly developing Cold War. During that decade, U.S. strategic planning, based on the capabilities and limitations of our military arsenal, compelled the establishment of several forward bases on foreign soil. And these in turn created new problems, as the risk of accident could create diplomatic challenges. And accidents did occur. Two in 1956 at these foreign bases, involving nuclear weapons. And is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1950, the U.S. was becoming increasingly worried about the threat of global communism. The 1948 victory of the Communists in the Chinese Civil War, as well as the then still undecided conflict in Korea, represented a grave concern. The U.S. strategy was one of deterrence, intending to offer a credible nuclear threat that would prevent the Soviet Union or anyone else from considering an attack. As strategic bombers were the only credible way of delivering nuclear weapons at the time, that strategy relied upon foreign bases. The forward base strategy between 1950 and 1960 was based largely on the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. Introduced in 1951, the six-engine, turbojet-powered strategic bomber was built to fly at high altitude, with a service ceiling of 40,500 feet and high, albeit subsonic, cruising speed of 557 miles per hour, allowing it to avoid interceptors. The nuclear-capable medium bomber could carry 25,000 pounds of ordnance, which included a range of nuclear weapons of varying yields. It was a formidable aircraft that quickly became the backbone of the Strategic Air Command. In his 2000 book B-47 Stratojet, Boeing's Brilliant Bomber, Jim Tegler writes that, viewed through the telescopic lens of history, we now recognize Boeing's B-47 as one of the most important aircraft of the 20th century. It was America's first truly successful jet bomber, the product of cutting-edge research and an innovative design which incorporated the most advanced ideas of its day in aerodynamics and propulsion. More than 2,000 were built, and the United States Air Force would eventually equip 28 B-47 wings. In the early years, the B-47 operated at the same time as the heavy Convair B-36, but the B-36 was much slower, and while capable of reaching the Soviet Union and carrying a much larger payload, the B-36 was potentially more vulnerable to fighter interceptors. The B-47 was much faster and had in-air refueling capability, but being a medium bomber, the B-47 traded speed for range. It could not attack the Soviet Union from the continental United States without refueling. In a 1998 report sponsored by the United States Air Force, Kurt Schaik of the Department of History of Norwegian University of Science and Technology writes that in these early years, the lack of a true long-range intercontinental bombing force made SAC almost completely dependent upon overseas bases in order to conduct its atomic offensive. It was not only a matter of aircraft range. The logistical support required for an atomic campaign was such that, for rapid response, that support had to be located at a forward base. The need for forward deployment was so great that, the Institute of Defense Analysis writes, it was felt in SAC in those years that the absence or loss of forward bases would cut SAC's striking power fully as much as if the greater part of SAC were destroyed on the ground. These forward operating bases started in two places. Schaik notes that the first half of 1951 saw the activation of deployment of two new SAC air divisions, created specifically to control bombers and bases overseas. The 5th Air Division, responsible for French Morocco, formed on 14 January 1951 at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. The 7th Air Division, responsible for the United Kingdom, formed on 10 March 1951 at Offutt. In March of 1952, Time magazine explained the reasoning for using bases in French Morocco. From Morocco, SAC will be in easy range of Soviet targets in Ukraine, the Caucasus oil fields, in fact, any targets in European Russia from Moscow to the southern frontier. Yet the Moroccan bases are almost unreachable from the USSR by land. To take them, short of an airborne assault, the Red Army would have to skirt the eastern Mediterranean and cross the whole of North Africa. European bases may give us 10% more hitting power, says one Air Force officer, but Morocco gives us 90% more staying power. Access to these bases required a diplomatic agreement, but one with a dangerous wrinkle. A 1956 memorandum from the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs to the Secretary of State explained the history of the agreement. In 1950, shortly after the outbreak of the Korean War, defense established an urgent requirement for SAC bases in Morocco. The U.S. accordingly undertook negotiations for the establishment of these bases with the French government, in view of the latter's responsibilities for Moroccan foreign affairs under the Treaty of Fez. The problem was that the French role in Morocco seemed likely to change. The State Department would have preferred to include Morocco in the negotiations. The memorandum continues. During the negotiations, the U.S. urged the French to apprise the Sultan of Morocco thereof, but the French refused to do this. In light of the pressing need for the bases at the time, the U.S. decided it had to go ahead under the circumstances and conclude an agreement with the French. Subsequent to signing of the agreement, the French were again requested by us to inform the Moroccans in general terms of the agreement. As far as is known, this was never done. The failure to include the Moroccan government in the negotiations would prove a problem later. An agreement was reached in December of 1950. Originally, the agreement was to use existing French facilities, but those proved insufficient. The memorandum explains that it was found necessary to build completely new airfields. The French government acquired the land. The facilities were completed. 3 SAC bases and an Air Force supply depot. Time magazine underlined the U.S. desperation to complete the facilities quickly to support strategic objectives. The U.S.-French agreement for the bases was made in December 1950, at a time when the U.S. was threatened with defeat in Korea and when Eisenhower had not yet arrived in Europe to help shore up its defenses. Base construction in Morocco got underway as what the Pentagon calls a crash program, in which speed is all important and waste must be borne. GlobalSecurity.org explains, SAC devised a deployment program to use shorter-range B-47s. 3 bases were built in Morocco for this purpose. About 1/3 of the B-47 force was rotated on a 90-day basis, kept on 15-minute alert for that time period. The overseas bases moved the B-47s into effective range of their targets without aerial refueling. One of the 3 bases was near the city of Ben Guerir, which Time described as in the Rocky Flatlands at the foot of the Atlas Mountains. GlobalSecurity.org writes that Ben Guerir was critically important for SAC. Ben Guerir hosted the B-47 and KC-97, with an asphalt concrete runway of 14,000 feet. But there was an additional challenge. The agreement did not include the authority to permanently store nuclear weapons on the base. The military aviation website historicwings.com describes how the base was used in 1956. The Strategic Air Command's 305th and 306th Bombardment Wings were based at MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, Florida. Both were equipped with nuclear-capable B-47 Stratojet medium bombers. Missions were varied, but were designed to ensure that the United States Air Force provided continuous deterrence and pressure on the Soviet Union in the early years of the Cold War. To accomplish these missions, the SAC crews regularly deployed around the world, often basing from allies of the West that ringed the borders of the USSR. On March 10, 1956, 4 B-47 Stratojets of the 369th Bomb Squadron took off from MacDill Air Force Base en route to Ben Guerir Air Base, located just north of Marrakesh, Morocco. For the previous 3 years, B-47s had flown similar missions, crossing the Atlantic at high speeds. On March 12th, several American newspapers reported that one of the planes had gone missing. The stories were generally brief. The Elmira, New York Star-Gazette, for example, reported on the 12th, saying only a Strategic Air Force B-47 jet bomber is missing in western Algeria, an Air Force spokesman said today. A B-47 normally carries a crew of 3. The official statement, authorized by the Department of Defense, read, "The aircraft was one of a flight of 4, scheduled for nonstop deployment from MacDill Air Force Base to an overseas air base. Takeoff from MacDill and first refueling were normal. The second refueling point was over the Mediterranean Sea. In preparation for this, the flight penetrated solid cloud formation to descend to the refueling level of 14,000 feet. Base of the clouds was 14,500 feet, and visibility was poor. The aircraft, carrying 2 nuclear capsules and carrying cases, never made contact with the tanker. An extensive search failed to locate any traces of the missing aircraft or crew." The story is simple but strange. 4 aircraft had proceeded through cloud cover to meet a refueling tanker, but only 3 reached the tanker. The 4th was simply missing. There was no additional radio contact, no distress call. The plane simply vanished. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported, however, that there was a French news agency report that a B-47 exploded in flight near Sabatna in eastern French Morocco. The Star-Telegram also listed the names of the crew of the missing plane. Captain Robert Hodgen, 31, of Indianapolis. Captain Gordon M. Inslee, 32, of Ferndale, Michigan. And Second Lieutenant Ronald L. Kurtz, 22, of Overland Park, Kansas. The Aviation Safety Network report on the accident lists the aircraft as B-47E, serial number 52-534. The report explains, aircraft's last known position was over or near the Mediterranean Sea, south of Port Said, an Algerian coastal village near the Moroccan frontier. A French news agency reported that the plane may have exploded in flight near Sabatna in eastern French Morocco. The Air Force reported that the French position was roughly the same as the last report on the missing plane, about 90 miles south of Oran. A later report said the plane went down southeast of Port Said, an Algerian coastal village near the Moroccan frontier. Planes and French troops were to have searched the area, but found no wreckage. Air Force officials also said that ships from the Royal Navy abandoned their exercises in the Mediterranean and searched for wreckage of the plane, and troops in French and Spanish Morocco did likewise. An exhaustive search failed to locate the aircraft, its weapons, nor its crew. The report concludes, despite an extensive search, no debris was ever found, and the crash site has never been located. The crew has been declared dead. Disturbingly, the aircraft, while not carrying nuclear weapons, was carrying 2 capsules carrying bomb-ready nuclear weapons material. These were the radioactive cores for the Mark 15 nuclear bomb. HistoricWings.com explains. These were an essential part of the deployment to Ben Gurion Air Base, since there were no permanently stored nuclear weapons kept there. Since the nuclear weapons material was in carrying capsules, a nuclear detonation was impossible. Still, Historic Wings explains, while the story of the B-47 Broken Arrow has been mostly forgotten, it implies a dangerous reality. The region where the plane may have crashed is sparsely populated and in recent months has become the home of transnational terrorist groups. Were one of these groups to get lucky and find the nuclear material, likely still safely secured within their SAC capsules and radiation shielded for easy transportation, they would have the makings of a dirty bomb, at the very least. The Air Force has not released further details on the loss of the aircraft, call sign Inkspot 59. The official Department of Defense summary of the incident includes just the text of the original statement, with the line, "No weapons were aboard the aircraft, and only 2 capsules of nuclear weapons material in carrying cases. A nuclear detonation was not possible," added. The same year, another accident occurred in another critical forward base location, the United Kingdom. Sheikh notes that half of SAC's overseas bases were in the United Kingdom, and there was strong military justification for locating them there. The overriding reason was their prompt availability. Close relations between RAF and USAF leaders continued after World War II, leading to a string of military-to-military agreements to upgrade RAF bases to SAC bomber standards. One of those bases used was Lakenheath Royal Air Force Station, 20 miles north of Cambridge. The Center for Defense Information explains that it's not clear when American nuclear weapons were first deployed in Europe, but in early July 1950, President Truman approved the stockpiling of non-nuclear components at forward bases in England. As with Morocco, U.S. B-47s deployed on a rotational basis to bases in England, part of what was called Operation Reflex. On July 27th, a B-47 of the 307th Bombardment Wing, on rotation from Lincoln Air Force Base in Nebraska, was engaging in routine training. The website of the 307th explains. A 307th Bomb Wing B-47 commanded by Captain Russell Bowling was performing touch-and-goes when the aircraft lost control, porpoising or otherwise bouncing down the runway. The aircraft was not carrying any nuclear weapons. However, the 307th website continues. The aircraft careened into a nuclear weapons storage bunker. The entire crew was lost, and burning jet fuel consumed 3 Mark VI low-kiloton nuclear weapons. The lost crew were identified as Captain Russell R. Bowling, Lieutenant Carol W. Kahlberg, Lieutenant Michael J. Selmo, and Tech Sergeant John Ulrich. The official summary of the accident reads, a B-47 aircraft with no weapons aboard was on a routine training mission making touch-and-go landing when the aircraft suddenly went out of control and slid off the runway, crashed into a storage igloo containing several nuclear weapons. The bombs did not burn or detonate. There was no contamination or cleanup problems. The damaged weapons and components were returned to the Atomic Energy Commission. The weapons that were involved were in storage configuration. No capsules of nuclear materials were in the weapon or present in the building. While the summary was apparently intended to minimize the damage and stress that there was little nuclear risk, the official communiqué to General LeMay, kept classified at the time, suggested the event was a tad more exciting than the summary suggests. The B-47 tore apart the igloo and knocked about 3 Mark 6s. The aircraft then exploded, showering burning fuel over all. Crew perished. Most of the aircraft wreckage pivoted on igloo and came to rest with an aircraft nose just beyond the igloo bank, which kept main fuel fire outside smashed igloo. And then the most disturbing line. Preliminary exam by bomb disposal officer says, a miracle that 1 Mark 6, with exposed detonators sheared, didn't go. What would go have meant? The Center for Defense Information explains. Each bomb had about 8,000 pounds of TNT as part of its trigger mechanism. The blazing jet fuel did not ignite the TNT and was extinguished by the base firefighters. It is possible that part of eastern England would have become a desert had the TNT exploded and showered radioactive materials over a wide area, said a now-retired Air Force general who was in the UK at the time. It was a combination of tremendous heroism, good fortune, and the will of God, said a former Air Force officer who was on the scene. These weren't the only accidents involving American nuclear weapons at foreign bases. They weren't even the only accidents involving American nuclear weapons and the B-47 bomber. They were merely the only such accidents that were acknowledged by the United States to have occurred in the year 1956. Still, the strategic thinking that placed these forward SAC bases between 1950 and 1960 was always a limited-time arrangement. Shake notes that the first Strategic Air Command forward base opened in 1950, and by 1960 their demise was already well underway. In fact, in Morocco, the writing was already on the wall when Ink Spot 59 disappeared. In 1956, Morocco gained its independence and decided to vacate the base agreements that had been made with the French, and the U.S. had vacated all the Moroccan bases by 1963. In the United Kingdom, the development of the UK's own nuclear weapons reduced the need for the United States to store nuclear weapons there, although the United States did not remove all of its nuclear weapons from the United Kingdom until 2008. The development of the B-52 bomber gave the United States a truly intercontinental bomber capability, and that reduced the needs for these foreign bases, although the U.S. still deploys some nuclear weapons at forward bases in Europe. And Shake notes that even with an intercontinental capable bomber force, we still require some forward bases for logistics, things like in-air refueling. Still, the deployments that made these accidents in 1956 possible were part of a strategy that existed only for a limited period of the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.